Dear Professor Dr. Wiener, dear professors, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you in this 12th edition of the Watchers Conference. Today I would like to consider where we are in the financial crisis and the economic recovery, to describe the emerging contours of a post-crisis order, both in Europe and in the wider world, and to reflect on what has been achieved by the global policy response to the crisis and what remains to be done. That makes a lot, so I would be very, very concise. Where do we currently stand in the crisis? We are now almost 3 years into the crisis. And you might remember that we were the first central bank to make a diagnosis as early as the 9th of August on the fact that we were entering in a period of financial turbulence that were very grave and calling for appropriate action. The development of the crisis was marked by a progressive collapse of confidence, seizing up of markets, dramatic financial events impacting the global financial system, very sharp decline in trade, and free-falling economic activity in the industrial world. We can all feel relief that the collective international efforts to avert catastrophe in the winter of 2008-2009 have been successful. I am convinced that had we not engaged in extraordinary action, we would have experienced the worst crisis not only since World War II, but probably since World War I. But events over the past few months have made clear that it is still too early to declare the crisis over. And just as they have done throughout the crisis, authorities in Europe and around the globe continue to respond to shifting economic and financial circumstances with swift, decisive, and, I trust, effective action. In early May 2010, the gravity of the situation was such that public authorities in Europe had to step in with unprecedented actions in terms of quantity and quality to restore a sense of direction and renew confidence. Over the past 3 years, much has been achieved, but much remains to be done. Restoring confidence and a clear sense of direction does not mean going back to business as usual. The crisis has shown that we need to make fundamental changes to the way we manage our financial systems, our public budgets, and the interactions between the national and international institutions that oversee the world economy. There is a strong, in my view, unity of purpose amongst the world's policymakers to eliminate the fragilities of the global financial system and the global economy in order to achieve strong, balanced, non-inflationary and sustainable economic growth. We are now at a stage in which we have to finalize new rules and regulation that will help to make our economy more resilient in the future. This means that we are now in the time of implementation of decisions already taken and in the ultimate preparation of the new rules and regulations. It is a very, very important phase, and it requires our full attention. I see 3 areas at the core of efforts that will contribute to shaping the contour of the post-crisis order. First, institutions. As the Nobel laureate Douglas North said 20 years ago, institutions exist to reduce uncertainty in the world. That message remains true today. We need strong institutions with clear responsibility and which offer a framework for dialogue and formal agreement. This is all the more important at the global level. The scope of international cooperation is broadening significantly as our economies are becoming increasingly connected. This is reflected in current efforts to strengthen the mandates and governance structures of existing international institutions. At the same time, existing informal fora are being adjusted and new fora developed. Examples are manifold. The G20 has emerged as a prime group for global economic governance. I think it's a revolution. The crisis has given birth to a new prime group for global governance, informal global governance. The G7 has passed the baton to the G20, and it is a major change, as I said, a revolution in global governance. In the constituency of central bankers, we have created the Global Economy Meeting a long time ago, but the Global Economy Meeting is now the prime group for governance of cooperation among central banks. And it's exactly the same phenomenon. The G10 passed the baton to the Global Economy Meeting. The emerging countries are now at the heart of global governance in both defined ministers and governors and heads meeting and central banks meeting. And the Financial Stability Board represents all systematically important emerging market economies. These are encouraging developments, very important developments, and must continue, of course, to pursue this path. The second area at the core of our efforts concerns reforms of the financial sector. This is also an area where further progress, much further progress is needed. The extent of the financial crisis leaves no doubt that tighter regulation and supervision are required to overhaul the financial system. We know that the crisis originated mainly in institutions that had moved away from traditional banking and which increasingly relied on non-interest sources of income and non-deposit funding. Reforms should be designed in a way that internalizes the social responsibility that financial institutions bear for savers and society as a whole. How can this be achieved? The answer can be summed up in 4 dimensions. More transparency, better regulation, less procyclicality, and less short-termism. More transparency is needed to ensure that financial market participants return to their prime mission of assessing the quality of investment. Securitization lessens lenders' incentives for prudent screening and steady monitoring. And I don't elaborate too much on that. We all have all those diagnoses in our mind. Better, second point, that is more effective regulation will ensure that no financial product and no financial market participant can escape the eyes of supervising authorities. Many financial players with high leverage have gone unchecked by our regulatory system. Better regulation will expose the risks inherent in the financial system and make the system more stable. Needless to say, highly leveraged institutions should be part and parcel of this process. Third point, less procyclicality of the financial system will reduce market volatility. Regulation should attend to limit the risk that banks assume by imposing higher counter-cyclical capital requirements, thus limiting leverage. Financial institutions will be asked to raise the quality and quantity of their capital base to ensure they have adequate funding in place as a buffer against future market disruption. And the fourth point that I would like to mention would be less short-termism. The promise of significant returns in the short term was often linked to a misjudgment of underlying risk. At the level of individual institutions, compensation schemes must be adjusted to avoid encouraging excessive risk-taking on the basis of relatively small amounts of capital. Instead, the incentive structure should encourage profitability over the medium to longer term. Let me say that all this is absolutely of the essence. I remind all of us one set of figures on both sides of the Atlantic, only to avoid a Great Depression, and without counting the activation of the economy going through the fiscal channel. I will be back to that, but only counting what has been done to support the financial system, adding up the option of recapitalization, option of guarantee of diverse nature, the option for helping solve the toxic asset issue. We have on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it is particularly impressive, 27% of the GDP. These were not spendings, these were not losses, these were risks that the taxpayer on both sides of the Atlantic put on the table, all taken into account, to help avoiding the Great Depression. We won't do that twice. We did that once, we won't do that twice. And we have to be sure, therefore, that the financial system is sufficiently resilient not to put ourselves, and when I say ourselves, I mean the industrialized world, in a situation which would be as clumsy and as dramatic as the situation we just experienced. Now, the third area of work concerns fiscal consolidation. This affects all industrialized economies. Governments must send a clear message to markets, a message of determination and commitment to sound macroeconomic policy, sound fiscal policies. There is no doubt that bold government actions, including large capital injections in support of the financial sector, help to cushion the impact of the financial crisis. But many countries in the industrialized world have reached the limits of fiscal expansion. Rising debt levels and large fiscal deficits have raised concerns among financial market participants about the longer-term sustainability of public finances. Just like consumers and countries, governments cannot live beyond their means forever. Fiscal authorities need to look beyond the current cyclical upturn. There is no alternative to that. Let me remind you of an often forgotten remark by John Maynard Keynes in 1937, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, when he said, just as it was advisable for the government to incur debt during the slump, so for the same reasons, it is now advisable that they should incline to the opposite. Fiscal consolidation and growth are not mutually exclusive. We, in the Governing Council of the ECB, totally disagree with the view that reducing public expenditures will hinder economic growth. On the contrary, we trust that prudent fiscal management provides the basis for balanced and sustainable growth. Stability-oriented fiscal policies will foster confidence amongst households, amongst enterprises, and ultimately, of course, will increase our welfare by creating new jobs, also improving confidence of investors and savers, national and international. Now, how should we address European modalities of today's global challenges? Again, for me, we have to cope with global challenges today as well as yesterday when we had to cope with the financial crisis. But there are European modalities. I would say that Europe is specifically responding to these challenges. An ambitious agenda lies before the continent. It is not only a visionary agenda, it has to be pursued with determination right now. And I would say that we have to demonstrate today the same spirit with which the European Union was progressively developed over the past half-century, setting objectives, agreeing deadlines, and mobilizing the necessary, when